This is the audiobook recording of The Little Dream, written by Dana Wellman, 2020, narrated by Vicky Jo Eva. Who knows how these places come into existence? Like when a shortcut is walked by many different people, and over time, a worn path eventually emerges. They call this phenomenon a wandering. No one built it. No one conceived it or planned it, but there it is. It exists as an artifact of necessity. It's in this same way that a place like Hermesium would come into existence, the trading and merchant hub of the interstellar sectional convergence. No founders, no mayor and no council, but here it stands, an artifact of necessity. In the year 6530, it exists and thrives as a bustling monument to trade, commerce, and the almighty marker. In stark contrast to its consumerist glow, however, Hermesium was also, as anyone who has been here will tell you, a cesspool of corruption, thievery, and greed. For the nearly 100 species of sentient life that frequent this market, it is a place where one can acquire goods found not easily or conveniently elsewhere, in many cases illegal goods. It is a curiosity in itself that although there are so many different types and styles of consciousness here, so many forms of intelligence with completely separate origins to one and other, they still converge here for the same age-old rituals of buying, selling and trading. But still, this might also explain why, despite the vast differences in culture and thought itself even, they still have it in common to engage in the even older, more clandestine traditions of thievery, dishonesty and murder. Who can be sure if it is a characteristic of all sentient life to exhibit these traits, or if it is this place that by its very nature fosters these activities? Of all these races and forms of life, organic or technological, the lowest of the low is to be a human. Although a very rare sight nowadays, humans were still considered to be a blight on the intergalactic fraternity of worlds, a race that couldn't even help themselves, destroying their own world through war, waste, and apathy. Even worse, and more unwanted, is to be a human girl child. Even worse still is to be an orphan human girl child. A girl child named Eden. On Hermesium there are no places for little girls, or little ones of any kind for that matter. No place other than on the busy streets of the market trying to make some small pittance of a living from selling handmade trinkets or various scavenged items from the outskirts. "Gifts for your little ones back home, sir?" Eden inquired to a large hairy man of simian proportions, no doubt cargo security or some form of shipping worker on his way through the street. "Gift to take home for your children, sir," Eden persisted. The man looked around at eye level for the source of this irritation, then looked down to see the little human girl child, arm extended, shakily holding out a small plaited wristband, twisted and woven out of different coloured electrical wire. For a brief second he looked her in the eyes, the only place to look at on someone's face here on Hermesium, since they were both wearing atmosphere mitigators. The huge man roared with a cruel laughter, swiping her down with the back of his strange hand. Eden fell onto the grimy street, her tray of multicoloured trinkets spilling into the walkway. The putrid hominid explained in an unknown dialect as he continued on his way about the bustling street. The language that the man spoke was one of the less common dialects heard here, but still, from hearing certain phrases, more often than others, Eden was able to recognise the words human and pathetic. Gathering up her wares from the cold, wet street, scraping her nails on the rough asphalt, she straightened up and continued undeterred. After all, she had grown accustomed to this kind of treatment since her arrival here 2 Earth years ago. As far as she could tell by the time zone displays on the holo panels, she must be around the age of 6 or so, although she has no idea when her birthday might be. She knew that she was about 4 years old when her mother smuggled her out of the factory camps of Earth. "One day we will go to paradise, little one," Mother would always say to her. Eden remembered the time that she had with Mother back in the factory camps on Earth. In their small tattered tent at night, she would listen to stories from Mother's old book by the warm yellow light of their small candle. Those times might be the only happy times that Eden could remember. Before. Working and living in desperate poverty and being totally beholden to your employer. Well, that is no different to being a slave. All who remained on what was left of Earth lived in this way, as slaves in the factory camps. The rest of the planet was nothing but barren desert and the ruins of the old world. A factory camp was no place to have a child. The only way that Mother's supervisors would allow her to keep baby Eden was if she continued to make sure she was quiet and out of sight, teach her how to work the lines, and put her straight into rotation when she came of age. Of course, she was never going to let that happen to her only daughter. The supervisors would patrol the lines in the day, making sure your hands were worked to the bone, scolding or beating anyone who fell behind their rhythm. At night, they would patrol the tents, making sure no one ventured outside. Who knows when they slept, or if they slept at all. Their large grey eyes, cold and dead, never seemed to close. No one knew exactly what they were. However, they did have one familiar sickness. For human women. In the camps at night, they could do whatever they wanted. No one would stop them, because no one cared. That was all that Mother had ever known: work, torture, and loneliness. She had nothing to her name, save for a tattered blanket, a candle, and the hope in her chest. That kind of hope that every living creature has, the one that dances like a flame in your heart against all odds. The cargo vessels were loaded up every week for shipment to the outer posts. Mining and agricultural machinery parts for other planets, such a mundane and inadequate cause for all this suffering and toil. From her tent at night, Mother could see only one of these vessels as it would approach the bay for loading each week. Through the barricades, she would watch it come and go, dreaming of all the places it could possibly take her if she could just manage to somehow get on board. After seeing what they had done to other slaves for less, she could only imagine what kind of punishment would await a stowaway. It was dark and cold that night in the camp, as still as the grave. Mother awoke suddenly in her tent to the sound of movement coming from the underbrush and rubble that encircled the camp. Her heart beat faster than she could ignore. She looked out from her dwelling hesitantly as the supervisors were doing their patrols, and there, through the wire and the darkness, she saw him. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. She had never seen anyone from the wastes, not in her lifetime. She almost couldn't believe that anyone could survive out there. He was ragged and rough-looking. The apparent years of scavenging and fighting for survival were written on his body and in his physical presence. He saw her too, and for a moment they stared at each other. Although his image was confronting even to her, in his eyes there was a kindness, something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. And just as she did recognize it, he was gone into the dark again, like he was never there at all. The following night she wondered if she would see him again. That flash of memory, his gaze and his green eyes with their kind empathy. It became her one thought that spread across her days and weeks in the factory camp. To Mother, that one thought, that one event that would be so trivial, so forgettable and ordinary to some in the higher classes, had grown into her whole world. It was all she had in a place like the factory camp, where there was no freedom or comfort. When deprived of joy or passion, these small things are so much more appreciated and garnered in common with the best and most exciting of events, to be cherished like a gift. Weeks went by, and her hopes of seeing him again would eventually fade into the cacophony of the factory lines. The thin tether of warm hope in her chest was flickering like the candle that lit her small tent at night. Sirens howled. The scream of the alarm shrill and sharp, cutting the silence of her sleep. Mother woke in fright to the supervisors clambering to the fences, weapons pointed into the darkness, like the happy hour of assault, the hunting party looking for the fox and the joy of the catch. Could it be him again? She thought. In her panic, she forgot herself and stood up from the tent to see the commotion. Just as she did, a sizzle of hot pain shot down her spine and she fell to the ground. She screamed in shock as the filthy boot of the supervisor sharply shoved her back into the tent. The pain and shock, along with the noise and confusion outside, began to swirl around her like a pack of wild dogs, circling and gnawing, getting louder and more aggressive. The cold air, the fumes from the factory, the loneliness, the pain all somehow getting faster and faster, so indifferent to her. She pursed her eyes shut as hard as she could, gasping for air. Warmth. Suddenly on her lips she felt warmth. A hand. Human? She opened her eyes to see him. His hand on her lips to quiet her, his other hand under her head to comfort her. His green eyes looking into hers, the flickering candle light bathing his face. Shh, he pleaded with a forced whisper. You are okay. They are much too busy looking for me. She felt eased by him, and the swirling of confusion and pain was starting to fade away. Who are you? She whispered back. My name is Genon. Genon, she repeated. Suddenly a new fear crept into her focus. You have to hide. If they catch you, they will kill you. She pushed him into the corner of the tent and covered him with her only blanket. Be quiet. They don't allow men here at all. You shouldn't have come here. He lay as flat as he could, covered by the blanket. He stayed there for what seemed like hours, daring not to stir as the commotion outside slowly subsided. Eventually the camp became still once again. It was cold that night, just like it was every night here. She only had one old blanket, and she knew that they would have to huddle together to stay warm for the night. The warmth of his body was a soothing and strange sort of comfort that felt contraband to her after years in this place. The smell of his hair seemed so foreign and told a story of hardship. Why would you come here? Why, when you were free out there beyond the camp? She asked. Free, he answered. What do you think is beyond this camp? It is not freedom. It is bare survival and fear. There is no rest or peace out there. I was lucky enough to evade the dregs for the earlier years, but these last few months they have pursued me relentlessly. Dregs? What are dregs? She asked. I think they must have been human once, like us. Well, not like us at all, really. They eat people like us. They are cannibal scum. There are gangs of them out there, picking the bones of the long-dead earth. Eventually, I knew if I could somehow break into this place, I would finally be free of them. It was my last resort. Up until now, Mother had no idea what was beyond the camp. As Genon told of his torment and pursuit by those things out there in the wastes, it occurred to her that his life was not that different from her own. That's when I saw you from beyond the fence. Thank you for hiding me. What is your name? She suddenly realized something forgotten, or never considered at all. Something long lost and completely neglected. I have no name, she stuttered. Tears began to well in her eyes, and Genon saw that she was ashamed. He brushed his hand across her face, slowly wiping the tear that fell onto her cheek. He saw in her, too, the pain and longing that he himself had felt. and he saw her beauty. Having something to live for, to look forward to, changed Mother, made her life worth being present for, and made the hardship of the factory seem, in a small way, more tolerable. It also made the days longer, as she couldn't wait to get back to the tent, back to him. Once they were out of the periphery of the supervisors and could speak, she would listen to his stories and share her ration, and together they would talk and eat. These were the most cherished moments for her. She felt happiness for the first time in her life. One night in the tent, Genon reached into his bag and produced a very old book. Mother was fascinated by it. "This is a book of paradise," he said. "I found it in the wastes years ago. Most of the pages are torn out and missing, and the cover is gone. But some of the first section is still there, and it has been enough to keep me going for years now, to give me hope. It tells of a better world, a perfect garden where two humans live in peace and harmony, with nature, and all is beautiful and good." "Such a place! Can it be real?" she wondered. Genon went on. "I have spent years searching for this place, or at least the rest of this book. It must tell us how to get there. It must have a map or some kind of instructions on how to get there. But I haven't found it yet." "It sounds beautiful, somewhere to be free and live the way we choose. What is the name of this place?" she asked. And he replied, "Eden. One day I will find it." He looked at her with hazel and honesty. "And when I do, I will take you there." She felt something inside herself. Hope? But something else as well. She leaned into him, and they held each other warm against the sharp night air. The next day at the factory, she couldn't keep the smile off of her face. The work somehow seemed like a dream taking place in front of her. The day floated by with ease, and even though the usual scoldings and lashings from the supervisors were ever present, she couldn't say when or where they occurred specifically, as she was in her own world now, a world they could not touch. The supervisors led the workers out of the factory for the day, shoving her through the lines with the others, coldly dumping a ration on her tray and sending her back to the tents. She was the only one there smiling. As the line moved on slowly toward the tents, she thought of Eden. She imagined lush forests with animals and colourful plants and flowers. A cool stream of fresh water running down to a small grassy clearing. She could see Genon there, healthy and clean, smiling at her with that kindness. Her daydream was as vivid as any. The sounds of the stream and the birds accompanying her as she walked towards him. She imagined reaching out to touch his face. Then suddenly it all fell away. She heard a scream in the cold air, the smell of oil and smoke, just like the tide of a vengeful ocean. Reality came pouring back in, flooding her senses, sweeping away her security and exposing her to the bare-naked, brutal suffering of the sea. The supervisors pushed her down, pressing her face against the cold mud. She heard that scream again. It was a man's voice. Grabbing her by the hair, they yanked her face upward toward the group of others. She resisted, but it was in vain. The group of supervisors were huddled around something. Stepping aside at the command of the one that held her by the hair, the supervisors brought forth their prize. It was Genon, broken and bloody, but alive. They had found him. How? Her mind raced with a panic she had never felt before. She screamed at them, pleading with them to let him go. They responded by hitting her across the face so hard that she almost felt her sight lapse amidst the searing sting of pain. They didn't speak. They simply brought Genon forward, as if presenting him to her. She screamed through her sorrow as tears fell down her face. The steely grey eyes of the supervisor stared at her blankly, with a cold malevolence. "Don't cry," Gennon said calmly. He smiled at her through his pain. "I'll find you in Eden." And then, with a cruel haste, the supervisor retched upward and broke his neck. Mother screamed louder than she ever had before, her lungs giving out to a broken husk as she sobbed and struggled pointlessly against the tight grip that held her. They shoved her down into the dirt as Gennon fell to the ground beside her. Through the tears, she stared at his face. The face she had loved. That kind honesty and warmth now fading from his hazel eyes, as he lay still and motionless in the cold mud. As the years went by, the memory of that time grew more and more distant. It had to be distant. She had to push it all down. It was impossible to live with the thought of what they did to Gennon. She had to try and forget the joy, the love. She had to switch herself back off again. After all, she had a new problem now. Her daughter Eden must not, will not grow up in this place. The cargo ships came and went. The lights and the noises coming from them were common now. She had to almost rediscover them as she analysed their movements and schedules. She sat awake at night studying them, her foot gently rocking the makeshift crib she had made with Eden fast asleep inside. Besides the lights and sounds, there was a distinct smell emanating from these ships. Ionized particles in the air, like the smell just before a rainstorm. These kind of vessels often utilized ionic thrusters that would cause this smell. She would close her eyes and imagine the rain. Breathing it in, she imagined the paradise of Eden from Gennon's book. This smell was tranquility. This smell was freedom. After a time, she would be able to teach Eden some things about the world she knew. She would read to her from the book Gennon had left. It was precious to her, and she kept it close always. "Mummy, I want story," pleaded Eden. "All right, little one, hop into the blanket and get ready for sleep." She opened the book and started to read of the paradise of Eden. "Mummy, why my name Eden, like the place in the story?" inquired the little girl. "Because, little one, Eden is the most beautiful place in the universe and our home. It is perfect and green, full of colourful plants and birds. It is our paradise. What better name for the most beautiful and perfect little girl in the world than Eden?" Mother told her with a smile. The hour was getting late, and Eden's little eyelids were struggling to stay open as she sleepily persisted. "Mummy, can we go there, to the beautiful place?" Stroking her mousy hair, Mother replied, "Yes, little one, we will go there one day, I promise you." Eden was now fast asleep, and Mother breathed a sigh, turning her attention to the lights and sounds of the cargo ships in the distance. "I promise you," she thought. The supervisors seemed to leave her alone a little more during the night now. Although it was worse during the day in the factory, she would worry herself sick about leaving Eden in the tent alone. Eden was such a good girl. She never left the tent by herself, not once. It had been some time now, and even though Eden was still so small, Mother knew that as far as the supervisors were concerned, she would be ready to work the lines very soon, and a life of pain and hostility would await her. Darkness drew down on another day at the factory camp. A night that seemed like any other, but not to Mother. This was the night. It was time. She had been watching these cargo ships for years now, and their scheduling might seem random to some people, but not to her. She doubted that the supervisors would even expect any of the human women here to notice the patterns at all, considering their arrogance and their very low regard for humans in general. She thought this might work to her advantage. But After what happened to Genon, and what might happen to Eden if they were caught, she could not afford to be complacent in any way. The ships would come tonight, and there would be 2 of them, simultaneously docking for pickup and then leaving for who knows where. There were 3 fences topped with heavy razor wire in between the tents and the rear side of the factory where the ships docked, with a considerable distance between each of them. On the ships themselves, there were 4 main engines and several small stabilising struts that held the ship in place while it was docked. These struts were cylindrical and each about the size of her small tent, as far as she could tell. It seemed that they were used for docking and take-off only. Once loading was complete, she noticed that they retracted through the fuselage and appeared to lock into place inside the vessel. This was the way in. It was a gamble, and this was what troubled her the most. If those struts didn't retract the way she hoped, then her and Eden could be killed. It was a huge risk, but it was better than letting her grow up here. What those monsters would do to her. The thought of it made her sick in her stomach. "Tonight, little one." Mother sat Eden down. "Tonight is very important, do you understand me?" Eden sat up straight and nodded her head in obedience. "Tonight we are leaving here forever." "What, Mummy? Are we going to the paradise? Are we going to see the birds and plants?" "Shh," Mother insisted. She thought for a second and replied, "Yes, little one, we are going to Eden." She knew this would give her the resolution she needed for what was coming next. "But first, little one, we must go through a very hard and scary game that we are not allowed to lose, okay?" She nodded cautiously. "Just do as Mummy says, and it will all be okay. And whatever you do, little one, don't scream. Don't make any sound at all, or we will lose the game. Do you understand me?" To see Eden's little face nodding and the trepidation in her eyes was galvanizing to Mother in that moment. She knew there was no turning back from this now. The blanket she had, the only one she had, the same one she had used to hide Genon those years ago, now looking threadbare in spots, with a few small holes where it had worn away. She held it out in front of her, and with a jerking movement she tore it in 2. The larger half she wrapped around her waist, and the smaller she would tear into 3 more strips to plait a small crude rope. "We must go now, little one," she insisted, holding out her hand for Eden. "Take the book, sweetheart, and keep it close by you, okay?" Eden nodded enthusiastically. "Now, jump onto Mummy's back." "Like a piggyback?" Eden asked, with a hint of excitement. "Yes, just like that, sweetie." Mother lifted Eden up onto her back, where she held on with her arms and legs so tight that the 2 of them almost seemed as one. There weren't as many patrols near her tent of late. Perhaps they saw less of a threat in a mother with a small child than they would the other women, or less of an enticement. She waited patiently, staring through a small hole in the canvas of her old tent until the single supervisor that lingered near had turned down a neighbouring row of tents. As the supervisor turned away, she made her move, Eden tightly clinging to her. She ran swiftly and silently on bare feet through the mud and refuse that paved the camp. Her adrenaline was running hot. She moved as if unencumbered by the weight of Eden on her back. Passing the last row of tents, now she broke into a sprint to cover the vast distance from the edge of the camp to the first razor wire fence, hushing her breathing as she ran. She could see the first fence glinting in the darkness. Skidding to a halt, she bent down on one knee. "Hop down now, little one," she panted in a whispered breath. Eden let go of her mother and stood in front of her. The mud was cold on her feet. Mother removed the large section of the blanket that she had tied around her waist and held it outwards, giving Eden a little smile. Then she threw it upwards, onto the razor wire at the top of the fence. "Wait here, Eden. I'll climb up, and then I will pull you up and over with this piece of rope, okay?" Eden nodded nervously. She had never seen this far outside the tents before, and her little heart was racing. But she trusted in what her mother had said. Mother leapt onto the wire and began to climb. The fence was around the height of 2 people. She pushed her fingers and toes through the wire to make her way up. The blanket was there to cover the razor wire. She threw her leg over the top, and then straddling the blanket with her legs, she lowered the crude rope that she had fashioned. "Grab the rope, little one, and I will pull you up." Eden was so scared, she clutched that rope as hard as she could with both hands. Mother began to pull her up and over the fence. As she lowered Eden down the other side, she could feel the razor wire starting to tear through the old blanket as her weight pushed it against her skin. Finally, Eden was down outside the fence. Mother yanked the blanket from the razor wire and climbed down the other side. "It's piggyback time again, little one," she panted. Eden once again jumped on her mother's back and held tight. "We just have to do that 2 more times, Eden, and then we can hide in the big ship that will take us away." Eden was filled with wonder and excitement at the thought of leaving, but also terrified at the same time. Mother ran to the next boundary, fast and silent. As she skidded into the second fence, she smelled that smell again. Ionized particles in the air. The smell of rain. The smell of freedom. As she threw the blanket over the razor wire, she realized just how much of it had torn off on the last fence. Suddenly the noise came blaring through the night air. The ship was docking. They didn't have much time. It had never felt so loud before. It had never been so close before. She again pulled herself up to the blanket and lowered the rope. This time, as soon as she began to pull Eden up, she felt the blanket rip. It tore almost in 2, lowering her thighs into the razor wire. She felt a horrible tearing. Her skin was burning with the skin of the razors cutting into her legs. She did her best to mitigate the scream that was coming out of her mouth. "Mummy, are you okay?" Eden shouted recklessly. "Quiet, little one, quiet," Mother whispered, as harshly as one could whisper. "Remember, no noise, or we lose the game." Eden looked at her mother's face, and she could see the grimace of pain being forced back into a smile. "Sorry, Mother, no noise, I promise." Mother pulled Eden up and over the fence, lowering her down. She realized that now she would have to pull herself out of the razor wire, and there was no time to do it slowly. She grit her teeth and yanked herself off of the razors. The pain was searing and horrible, worse than anything she had felt before. In her panic, she tried to clutch hold of the blanket and lost her grip, falling over the side and landing with a thud at Eden's feet. Almost passing out, she forced herself up. She had no choice. She tried her hardest to compartmentalize the pain, but she could feel the wet sensation of blood running down her legs. She knew she was cut deep. "Piggyback time again, little one," she insisted wearily. Eden looked at the blood coming out of her mother and then looked at her face. "Hurry, Eden. Mummy's fine, just a scrape." Once again she climbed onto Mother's back, and they made their way to the last fence. Mother was running as fast as possible. She could hardly feel her legs by now, and as they approached the next boundary, she knew that without the blanket, the next climb over the razor wire could very well kill her. She skidded into the fence. The noise and heat from the ship was so close now. She put Eden down and leaped onto the fence, pushing her fingers and toes through the wire that was instantly slickened by the blood running down her legs. Knowing there was no blanket to cover the razor wire, this time she threw herself over the top, collapsing onto the sharp blades, hushing the cry of pain that forced its way from her mouth. "Mummy!" Eden couldn't help but scream out, though now the sound of the ship's engines, preparing for departure, were loud enough that no one would hear her. Mother flicked the rope down. "Grab hold, little one. Don't be scared." Mother's voice had changed now. She sounded tired. She knew that the only way to pull Eden up was to anchor herself by her legs as she straddled the razor wire and used both arms to pull her over. Eden's little face was worried as she clutched the piece of rope. Mother pulled with everything she had left. She could feel the strength draining from her like water, the blades irreparably destroying her body. She pulled Eden up and held her in her arms. "We have almost won the game," she stammered. "All you have to do now, little one, is run. Run to that ship and hold on to that piece as it pulls you inside, okay?" Eden stared back at Mother. Her tiny lips started to shake. She could see all the blood running, pouring down the fence and pooling on the ground. She began to cry as she clutched Mother so tight. "I don't want to go, Mummy, I don't want to go," she sobbed. Mother held her close. "Everything will be okay, little one. Go to Eden, and your father and I will see you again there. We will be together there, I promise you." The two of them sobbed in each other's arms. Mother looked Eden in the eyes. "Don't you ever forget that I love you, and I always will." Before Eden could say it back, Mother swung her down to the bottom of the fence, where she fell into the cold mud. "Run! Run, Eden!" Eden could hardly see the ground in front of her through the tears, but she ran as fast as her little legs could carry her. She came to the landing gear and wrapped her small arms tightly against the circumference of the stabilizer. She looked back at Mother, strewn across the razors, the fence glistening with her blood. And then suddenly, just as Mother said it would, the strut retracted, pulling Eden inside the ship, and the hatch closed. When Eden first arrived on Hermesium, she thought maybe it was the place that Mother wanted her to go, the paradise from the book, the place she was named after. She tumbled out of the cargo hold, covered in grease and soot from the ship. It was almost a miracle she had survived the journey in that dark metallic box. She fell onto the hard street of the busy market. So many people. So many strange-looking people. They didn't look like her and Mother. Starving, she tried to find food or someone to help, but they wouldn't listen to her. They ignored her. "Do you know where my mummy is?" she questioned the passers-by. "Where is my mummy? Do you know?" The desperation in her little voice fell onto the deaf ears of the street. The people were ignoring her, knocking into her little body as they walked by. She looked up toward the sky to see a dirty, half-broken neon sign that read, Hermesium. Almost simultaneously, she noticed the putrid heavy air become even more asphyxiating. She realized quickly that this was no Eden. She wondered why it was so hard to breathe here. The air was strange and smelled awful. She noticed that all these people were wearing odd-looking masks over their nose and mouth. She saw some of them stopping at kiosks to refill the small chamber on the mask with some kind of gas. She ran over to one of these kiosks and stood in front of it. A weird purple light began to scan her little face as she squinted. "Classification, human. Communication, Earth-speak," it barked at her in a strange artificial voice. "Atmosphere mitigators," it continued. "Learn more?" Yes," she answered. "Here on Hermesium, races and beings of all different worlds throughout the universe are brought together through the spirit of trade and commerce. As they all have varying biological requirements, the native atmosphere provided on Hermesium is a uniform base gas to which our mitigators add the required compounds for your specific atmospheric requirements. A simple facial scan will determine your specific species and planet of origin, and your custom mitigator will be filled and dispensed for a fee of only 100 markers." 100 markers? What is a marker? She thought, and where could I find 100 of them? She began to feel odd, kind of dizzy. She realised that she was struggling to breathe. It was a panic she couldn't quiet. She stumbled around the street. Her vision was starting to blur. She tried to grab hold of the clothing of people walking by, pleading to them for help. They ignored her as she fell to the ground. Everything was spinning. Terrified, she pulled out the book that Mother had given to her and clutched it tightly. She was reminded of those nights in the tent when Mother would read to her while she lay warm in her blanket. "How much?" A rude and cold voice startled her. She sat up to see a strange-looking lady, with two others alongside her. "Is this translator on Earth speak? Look, you two, one of those human things from Earth." The odd lady shrieked. "Whatever!" One of the others snapped, seeming more interested in some sort of handheld device it was staring at. I can't breathe, Eden stammered. "How much for the Earth book?" the lady interrupted. 300 to 400 markers? She held out her bag and rifled through some coloured bits of paper. Eden realised that these must be markers. She looked at them and looked over at the kiosk, panting and coughing. The odd lady noticed this, and also that Eden had no mask. "Ah, okay then. 100 markers is what you need." "It's not for sale, it was my mother's," Eden cried. "Oh, boo-hoo, where is your spirit of commerce? This is her museum after all." The sobbing and coughing of Eden did nothing to soften this lady's heart at all. Maybe she didn't have one. Or maybe that was just the spirit of this place. Eden looked at the old book her mother had given her, and through her blurry eyes she glanced over at the kiosk. Everything was to spin faster and faster. "Come on, you need to breathe, don't you, human?" shrieked the vile woman. Eden knew that she had memorised every word of that book, and if she didn't get one of those atmosphere mitigators, she would suffocate and never get to Eden to see Mother. She held her little arm out shakily and handed the book to the lady. "Well, finally!" The woman snatched the book from Eden's hands, crumpling it in her 3-fingered grip. She dropped a piece of pink paper into Eden's lap and then continued on down the street with her entourage in tow, cackling obnoxiously while skimming the contents of the book. Eden had no time to mourn the loss of her only possession as she clambered to her feet. The pink piece of paper had a list of bizarre writing on it that she had never seen before, and at the bottom it read 100 markers. She stumbled over to the kiosk. It shone that purple light on her face again and uttered something that Eden couldn't even make out. Her mind was a fog by now, and she could hardly stand, let alone listen. The screen indicated to a small slot beneath. She fed the 100 marker note into the slot, and the kiosk made a hissing sound before promptly ejecting a grey mask with 2 small canisters on the front. She quickly pressed it to her face and gasped as the clean, familiar oxygen filled her lungs. Her relief was interrupted by the voice coming from the kiosk. "Thank you for your purchase. You now have 24 hours of Earth air." She eventually caught her breath as she wondered how she would refill her mask after the 24 hours was up. How would she get more of these markers? Ever since that first day, Eden would find something to sell to passers-by, whether it was something found or something she could make using things she picked up on the street. Trinkets and souvenirs for the people visiting this place. A small wristband plaited from bits of red and green plastic, or a ring made from a shiny piece of glass wrapped in copper wire. 100 markers just to live for another day, and whatever else she could make was divided between small amounts of food and water that she would buy from the assorted vending machines along the market. For the 2 years she had lived here, scrounging just to survive, she had not heard anyone speak of the festival. Yet today, it was all over the billboards and holo panels. Everyone seemed to be talking about it. The thought of a festival seemed so exciting to her. She had never seen one before. The advertisements made it seem so fun, so colourful and happy. Looking up at the buildings, she saw one of these pretty advertisements. It had so many bright colours and pictures. The audio from it seemed to be emanating from her atmosphere mitigator as she looked on. The Hermesium Annual Festival of Trade and Commerce. Spend your markers on all kinds of fun souvenirs for the young ones and for you adults, all the exotic substances you can handle. Your wealth and fortune shall be blessed as we ring in the Hermesium New Year. New Year? She thought. I have already been here for 2 years and never seen this festival. Then she realised that a year on Hermesium was obviously equal to 2 Earth years. She had been here for that long and never thought to learn this. Survival took up all of her time and was all that she could afford to focus on. She wondered if she could dare wish for more now. Eden's routine was the same every day. Wake up early, fill her mask, and set off through the busy streets toward the outskirts, picking up scraps of glass, wire and metal as she went. Once she had gathered up enough materials, she would sit and make either plaited wristbands from coloured wire or crude small pendants out of green and blue glass. She had become quite adept at crafting these small trinkets. Sanding down the edges of the glass pieces on the ground to smooth them off, and then polishing them with oil from the street to make them appear to shine. Her tiny fingers were full of cuts and calluses from her work. Mother had taught her how to do a plait back on Earth, and it was the most useful skill to her now. It had made it possible for her to survive here all this time. Once she had a few things that were sellable, she would head to the main street and try her best to sell them. She was lucky that 100 markers didn't seem to be much money at all to these people, yet still she battled just to make that amount some days. After getting as much as she could for her items, she would go to the kiosk for more air. And if she had enough markers left, she would go by the vending machines for something to eat. It was usually late night by the time she was done, and thankfully on Hermesium there was no shortage of small nooks and alleyways to sleep in. On this night it was cold. The festival was the day after tomorrow. She huddled in the alley and thought of Mother and the words from that book. So busy, so preoccupied with the pursuit of wealth, the very nature of Hermesium was in a way intoxicating for some visitors. Living there, however, was like a kind of slavery in itself. Eden felt just as much a slave here as she had back on Earth. Her unfeeling, inhuman captors there were replaced here with markers. She was existing only to pull them out of the system and then put them back into the system again in exchange for one more day of living, if you could call it that. At night, Eden would dream of the place her mother had told her about in the book, and before long her thoughts would turn to escape. She had often seen signs in and about the market offering tours of exotic uninhabited planets. They had pictures of them, a desert planet with massive stretching dunes and seas of nothingness. The other planet that was often advertised was a wilderness-type world with lots of green, lush plant life and thick jungle-type areas. Eden wondered if they could take her to the paradise from Mother's book. Or even if somewhere on that green planet the jungle might give way to a vast clearing where the sun could shine through the canopy and touch the soft grass on the forest floor. She could see the image in her mind, and it was beautiful. Could it be the paradise Mother had described? Even if it wasn't, surely it had to be a better place than here. The sound of yelling and footsteps, vehicles humming and advertising holos chatting, all ran together to form the rowdy blunderbuss of sounds that was a typical Hermesium morning. The smell of greasy air mixed with the scent of hundreds of strange breakfasts and revolting liquids, all carried on the base gas into the atmosphere mitigator. This sensory juggernaut would shatter the peaceful sleep of Eden and remind her that she had to wake up and start the day. As she rubbed her sleepy eyes and sat upright in the soot of the alley, she thought about the tour vessels and those beautiful pictures. She decided to go and see them again. On the way through the crowded street, she began to realise that she was very hungry. Unfortunately, she had no markers for the vending machines, and not having a chance to make any of her trinkets for the day yet, she would have to put up with the rumbling in her stomach for now. She could see the top of what appeared to be the tour ship jutting out from above the crowded street. The light from the holo panels danced in her eyes as she approached the ticket kiosk. The panels had all the pretty pictures of the green planet she had hoped to see again. There was also a lot of strange writing that she couldn't make out. Nearby, there stood a huge man with hard-looking grey skin that looked more like a crust or some kind of hide. He had noticed Eden looking at the panel and walked over. She looked up at his massive character and pointed to the pictures of the green planet on the holo panel. Can you take me to here, sir?" she stammered, her little eyes full of hope. The man stood silent, arms folded with no reply. "In your ship, can I come with you to the green place?" Still, he stood silent. Eden's shoulders slouched back down as she realised this man or creature wouldn't even talk to her, and she would most likely have no way to get aboard the ship. Just as her eyes began to well up at the thought of this disappointment, she noticed an imposing shadow on the ground, moving slowly towards her. The man was leaning over to face her. She looked up and saw that they were now face to face, and before she could study the deep crevices and pockmarks in his huge visage, he unleashed a torrent of hot air and noise.
"Here, out of here!"
he boomed. Eden was frightened by the loud hollering of the man, and the smell of his breath was so terrible that it was pervading the intake of her oxygen mitigator. The man wouldn't stop his tirade, however, as he continued, for what seemed like forever, shouting right into her little face.
"Here, I'm told get out of here!"
She was so frightened, but he wouldn't stop shouting. "He must be so terribly angry," she thought. "Have I somehow made him so mad that he won't stop shouting at me?" Unable to communicate with him and having no idea how to placate the man, she felt so helpless that she started to cry. He suddenly ceased his verbal onslaught and stood back, staring at Eden. She apprehensively wiped her eyes on the sleeve of her tattered shirt and looked back up at him. The look on his huge face was one of confusion. He leant down again, quickly this time, and reached his hand out toward Eden's face. She was so sure he was going to hurt her. She could see how angry he looked, with no time to react. She closed her eyes in fear. But as she did, she felt a jostling on her head. Her mask. She had slid it onto the top of her head while she wiped her tears. The man shoved it back down onto the front of her face, and it made a sharp clicking sound right near her ear. The brutish man flicked a switch on her mask that she had not noticed before.
"Forest World Tour?"
A voice came from inside Eden's mask.
"Forest World Tour, for you small, dirty, human thing."
She suddenly realised this was the man talking to her, but it was coming from the mask. It must be some kind of translator he had activated or tuned in somehow. Composing herself as best as she could, she straightened up and replied, "Yes, I want you to take me there, please." The man's annoyed facial expression quickly gave way to a gaping smile that exposed his green squarish teeth.
"Ha-ha! The price is 1,000 markers then. You have 1,000 markers, human?"
He smirked.
"That's 1,000 markers. Get it, dum-dum?"
Eden was shocked. She had never even seen that many markers, or even thought about that many before. Her disappointment was evident enough to answer the man's question.
I didn't think so. Now get out of the way, shoo!
He shouted as he shoved her away and back into the street. Eden walked through the crowd, crestfallen, thinking about how she could ever get enough markers for that tour vessel to take her to the green planet. Her stomach growled, and she became very aware that she needed to make some trinkets to sell so that she could fill her mask for the day and hopefully get some food to eat. She walked on, staring at the ground, kicking a small piece of rock along the street. She couldn't keep her mind off that tour ship and the 1,000 markers it would take to buy a ticket. As she wandered on, the time began to escape her. Before she knew it, Eden had found herself in a strange part of the market. Looking up at the stalls and signs, she realised that this was an area that she had not been to before. This area seemed even dirtier than the parts of her museum she was familiar with. The people in this part of the market were different too. They seemed to be all wearing the same clothes, and everyone was much filthier in appearance too. As she looked around for landmarks or something recognisable to help her find her way back, she noticed what looked like massive hills past the buildings across the way. This intrigued her greatly. She imagined running up to the top of one of those hills and seeing the view from up there. The excitement overtook her as she ran through the streets to get closer to these huge mounds. Drawing nearer, she noticed that it began to smell worse and worse, coming to the foot of the first great mound. She could see that these hills were not regular hills, but they were composed of all kinds of rubbish and scraps. There was a sign nearby that had many lines of strange words on it. The bottom line read in Earth speak, "Hermesium refuse block." Eden looked out across the littered landscape. Could this be where all the junk and trash from the markets of Hermesium ends up? Pondering this, she soon realised that she could surely find all kinds of things here to make special trinkets out of and sell them back at the market. Stirred up by the thought of this new idea, she ran like an ant scampering up the first of many great mounds of junk and scrap that pervaded the landscape of the refuse block. It was excitement that she was feeling now, and it sufficiently distracted her from the rumbling in her stomach. Pretty pieces of coloured glass and plastic, red, blue, green, purple, shiny silver strands of metal wire and gold-coloured paper. All the beautiful things that people had just thrown away. She couldn't understand why people would just discard them. Before too long, she had made a beautiful necklace out of silver wire and plastic. She had used one of the wires to wrap around the shards of coloured plastic to form an intricate pattern. This was the best thing she had made yet, and surely it would sell easily. Then she could buy some food for herself and replenish her atmosphere mitigator. Still, she made a few bracelets from wire too, just to be sure. Gathering up her creations in a small piece of cloth she'd found, she began to descend the scrap mound and head back into the market. She tried to walk back the way she could remember coming, until she could eventually see the familiar tip of the tour ship protruding from above the crowd line. She rushed back to her familiar section of the market, her mind racing, as she wondered how many markers someone would pay for this amazing creation she had come up with. If she could make more things like this, she might even be able to afford a ticket for the tour ship and escape to the green planet, or maybe even find the paradise from Mother's book. Either way, the idea of an escape from Hermesium had never before felt so tangible. A warm feeling sprang forth from her little heart as she unfolded her cloth parcel to reveal the pretty necklace she had made at the refuse block. It glinted and glowed as the lights from the street collided with the coloured shards of plastic wrapped in silver wire. She held it up to the light. Her little fingers blistered and red from twisting and wrapping the wire into place. The lights mixed together and danced with each other as they reflected pretty patterns across the wet slick of the street. The warm feeling, she couldn't remember it, or maybe she had forgotten what it was. She remembered something that Mother used to say. Hope is faith in a dream coming true. From hope will come strength to see you through. If you have hope, then you need only your dreams to have purpose in all you do. Mother said it was something that Father had recited to her once, a poem from the old world. She always seemed so sad when she would talk about him. Eden didn't get to meet her father, but Mother said he was kind and brave and that one day they would all be together. She never really understood what the poem meant, but now as the light played on the street and the colours shone through her pretty necklace, it seemed to resonate with her in a new way. It made even the cold streets of her museum seem a little less heartless that day. Long before. Heat. The burning heat of the Earth's sun, unencumbered by the once resilient magnetosphere. It felt dry and merciless, just like the wasted desert below it. Genon opened his eyes, only a fraction before his eyelids reacted to protect his vision from the searing white wave of cruel dry light that enveloped him. In the distance, a faint sound slowly became a dull roar. Suddenly he remembered his situation and snapped awake. Rising exhausted to his feet, he felt the ache of 100 days of pursuit, 100 days, by his best count, since they had found him. The vultures picking on the bones of the long-dead earth. The dregs. He was too thirsty to even sweat, and his head pounded from dehydration. The dull roar was steadily becoming louder and louder. They would soon be in range again. Running was all that he could do to survive. There were too many of them to stay and fight, and there was no chance of surrender. They would strip his possessions and slaughter him for meat. Although the only possession he had to his name was that old tattered book, he would rather not part with it. The words in that nameless compendium had given him hope through the hardest and darkest of times. Even though he had committed most of it to memory, he felt it was important to hold on to it. Maybe one day he could pass it on to someone who needed hope. The roar of the terrible engines was almost deafening now as the dregs approached. Genon knew the only way to survive was to hide from them, as he had always done. He staggered forward and slid onto his stomach behind a pile of old rusted metal. He could see the scouting party on their machines of death steadily encroaching on his position. The relentless heat radiating from the surface of the road was deforming their silhouettes as they drew nearer. Genon quickly rolled down the embankment off to the side of the road, behind some rubble. He clutched the book tightly and peered through a small gap in the wreckage as the dregs began to roll through. The speed seemed to slow down, almost to a walking pace, as they came rumbling along the road. They were scanning the area, looking for anything they could kill, eat, or steal. For the first time, Genon could get an unobstructed view of them at a close distance. As he peered through the twisted steel and smoke, he could feel the vibration of their machines and see their pock-marked skin with its yellow-green hue. He could even smell their foul, caustic stench. But what were they? Surely they couldn't be human, he thought. Or were they once human, a long time ago? The cosmic radiation from space had, over time, stripped the few remaining species of life from the Earth. Had these dregs evolved, or endured due to some mutation or predisposition in their bodies? As Genon began to ponder this, he suddenly noticed one of them atop the rolling machine was now facing him, almost directly. He snapped his face away from the gap and turned to hide. "Stupid, stupid," he muttered under his breath. He clenched his eyes shut, held his breath, and just willed himself to be nothing, to be invisible in this moment. He waited, his ears on alert, as he focused to hear any change in their movements or rhythms. But nothing. Only the unchanged roar of the machines, slowly droning by. He gradually opened his eyes again and took in a deep breath. As he turned to peer through the gap in the rubble, as his eye lined up with the gap, it was met with the hideous face of the Dreg right in front of him, staring straight into him. Genon recoiled in shock, falling backwards to the ground, dust flying from his panicked movements. This thing had seen him now. It was hunting him. He scrambled to his feet and ran further down the incline, through the twisted remains and rubble. He could see the Dreg was reacting to the noise and advancing after him. He ran as fast as he could through the wreckage, his exhausted feet spurred on by fear, clumsily traversing the uneven terrain. His eyes scanned the rubble for a hiding place. When out of the dust and smoke, he caught sight of something on the ground, like a hatch or lid of some kind that seemed to lead underground. He knew that he couldn't keep this pace much longer, and this might be the only place for him to hide. He skidded violently in a swirl of dust and ash and grabbed hold of the hatch, yanking it open as he hurled himself through the small opening, letting the metal lid slam behind him. Genon felt a dull thud on his back as he hit the floor on the inside of the hatch. The ache shot through him as he realised that it must have been about a 6 to 8 foot drop from the opening to the ground. It was dark inside and cool. He could hear the roar of the Dreg's engines fading into the distance. A cautious relief came over him that seemed to dispel the aching in his back for a moment. Maybe he was rid of them, at least for now. Looking around in the darkness, Genon felt his way to a table and what felt like a lamp. After fumbling with it for a few seconds, he felt an igniter button and pushed it. The room lit up with the amber sunset of the flickering lamplight, to reveal what appeared to be living quarters. There was a bed, some chairs, a table, and some shelves. This must be some kind of bunker, he thought. From the layer of dust covering everything, he could see that it was long abandoned. Genon's eyes scanned over the room. It was evident that there had been some kind of struggle here at one time. Things were broken, and there were black smears on the ground. As he followed the streaking black marks along the floor, it occurred to him that it was blood. Old blood that had dried and turned black. Then his thoughts were confirmed, as the streaks led to a body. It was long decomposed, dry and still. There was just enough of the face left to see that this person had died fighting, violently and in pain. The hair was long and red, and the dress was torn and faded. In her right hand she was clutching something. Genon leaned in to have a closer look. He pulled her dry, stiff fingers open, and a small metal object fell to the ground. It was a key of some sort, though it was unclear what this key was for. As he continued to search the bunker, he came across what appeared to be a gap in the wall behind a half-smashed wooden shelf. He pulled the old shelf away and there was a door. It was slightly ajar, and as he went to open it, he noticed a small keyhole with a brass plate. He grasped the key that he had found and slid it into the lock. It fit. The hinges were bent. The door had clearly been forced open. He wondered what the woman had been trying to hide as he entered the hidden room. Stepping through the doorway, he shone the lamp inside, and to his surprise he saw pink. A pink room, with a little powder pink bed and some homemade toys. A baby's room. After glancing around at the empty bedroom, suddenly, the struggle, the torn dress, the broken door and the key, it all made sense. She was trying to protect her child, and whoever or whatever had killed her had taken the child away. But to where? Genon thought for a moment and remembered the stories he had heard years ago of the work camps. Kids would be stolen from the wastes and put into slave camps. Sometimes babies, too. They would grow up there, working until they died, not knowing anything about their life before. He wondered if these camps might hold the last humans. Just as this thought ran through his mind, there was a huge cracking sound of metal on metal, and the harsh sunlight from outside the bunker came crashing in, hitting Genon's eyes like a blinding blow to the face. That dreg! It must have followed me. His mind was shocked into pragmatism. He quickly scanned the room as the hatch door continued to rattle from the impact of being slammed open. As he stammered, confused for a second, not knowing where to hide, a shadow came over the hatch opening, and he heard the horrible chattering sound that could only come from a dreg. The hatch door slammed shut again, with an immense clang. He turned and pulled himself behind the old broken door inside the child's room and forced himself silent. Quiet now. He imagined he was nothing at all, as motionless and silent as pure nothing. The time seemed to slow down as he tried to quell his panicked heartbeat, and the only thing that marked its passing were the sounds of the dreg climbing and crashing its way down into the bunker. It felt like forever. The heavy thud of its feet slowly approached as Genon began to hear the vile creature's chatter, reverberating off the hard walls of the small bunker. The acrid smell of the thing assaulted his senses. It was getting so close to the doorway now. Genon knew he was going to have to fight it if he was to have any chance of getting out of this alive. His eyes scanned the room for anything he could use to defend himself. He noticed a small metal bar that was part of the child's bed frame. It wasn't well attached. It seemed to be just leaning on the frame to help support the mattress. It was about long enough to make a usable weapon. The only problem was that the bed was right in front of the doorway, and if he went for it, he would be in full view. The putrid dreg was right in the doorway now. It was sniffing like it was tracking his scent. Coming closer to the door, the incessant sniffing, loud and rapid like an animal. It started to claw at the door as its sniffing grew louder and turned into a kind of grunting. It was cold and merciless, like a fox clawing and sniffing at a rabbit hole, like it was hungry. The door began to smack back and forth with the force of the dreg clawing at it. Genon knew that he had no choice left now. There was nowhere to run and no other options left. He sprung out from behind the door and rolled across the floor to the small bed. His feet landed on the other side and he pulled at the metal bar on the bed frame. As he yanked at it, he realised that it was stuck. He had misjudged it. The bar was attached at the other end by another small loose bolt. It's all over now. I'm not strong enough to fight this thing without a weapon, he thought as he forced his head up to meet the gaze of his inhuman pursuer. It was right in front of him now. It stood a little taller than him. Its disgusting mouth was like a torn opening or some kind of wound rather than a conventional mouth. As Genon looked at it, he saw that its eyes were milky, glazed over with some kind of cataracts forming on the lenses. It didn't react right away. It hesitated, peeking its head toward where the bolt had rattled with the force of Genon's desperate attempt to pull it free. It seemed to be listening, waiting for the next sound to come. What? This one must be blind, he thought. Just as he had realised that this dreg was unable to see him, the horrible creature lunged forward toward the bed frame, sniffing and clawing at the old bedding, gnawing on its own lifeless skin as it hung torn and swollen in the midst of its hideous mouth, soiling and salivating the dusty sheets. The sound of its gnashing was disgusting and terrifying. Genon knew this was his only chance. He held the bar as upright as the loose bolt would allow, and with all the strength he could summon from his starving, exhausted body, he kicked the base of the frame, jarring the bolt loose from its housing. As soon as this happened, the dreg's attention snapped to exactly the spot where Genon stood, and with a high-pitched, oscillating shrill, it shot forward in attack. Genon yanked the bar free, and with his teeth gritted and his lips pursed in wrath, he mercilessly bludgeoned the snarling thing across the head with every ounce of strength that he had. The head of the dreg jerked to the side from the force of the blow. It staggered back a step or two. Genon watched, panting, as the blood-streaked mucus dripped from the end of the metal bar. He studied it as it stood there, assessing the damage he had made to it, if any. At the very least, he hoped it was deterred, or at best maybe wounded too badly to continue its attack. It was hard to tell just what kind of state the dreg was in, as it stood for a moment, stunned. Genon's eyes shifted focus and began to look for an escape. He could see the doorway that led to the other room with the hatch above. Suddenly he heard a groan, and his eyes snapped back in line with the horrible creature in front of him. The thing raised its head and screeched a terrible, hostile cry. One of its milky, cataract-encrusted eyes was now red and bloodshot. Sooner than Genon could react, it had burst forth from where it stood and bouldered through him. They both fell violently to the dusty floor. Genon held the bar with a hand on either end to protect himself from the gnashing mouth of the thing. It was pushing its neck against the bar, chomping its jaws together, trying to bite at him. In its frenzy, it was biting its own frayed lips. As the torn skin broke, the blood sprayed him, along with the mucus and foul, humid air emanating from its mouth. He realized this thing was like some kind of animal, rather than an intelligent life form. It was as if it was crazed or infected with some kind of rabies. It pushed so hard down on him that the torn skin from its mouth began to touch his face. He pushed back with the metal bar as hard as he could, when suddenly the bar kinked in the middle from the force. The dreg's wet face slammed into Genon's. Without any hesitation, he rolled over onto his knees and squeezed the two ends of the kinked bar together as hard as he could. With the gnawing head of the dreg plied in the kinked metal bar, its hostile and unyielding attack had now tightened to a panic-fueled, seizure-like desperation. Genon clenched his eyes shut and shouted as he called upon all the remaining vigour he had left. The creature tensed and stiffened. Its back arched and hardened, and then after a moment, it fell back to the floor, lifeless and limp. The last gust of putrid air escaping its torn mouth with a sigh of finality. The room fell silent. Genon opened his eyes. At last, he could let his aching muscles relax as the dreg lay on the floor before him. There was no sound, no footsteps from above, no roaring of the engines from the road. They were all gone. This one must have been rogue, he thought to himself, perhaps diseased and outcast from the main party. He rolled onto his back to catch his breath. Staring at the ceiling, he began to wonder if there was ever going to be a place to rest. A peaceful place somewhere that people could live happy and content. A place where people were safe and loved. A place like the place in his old book. He glanced over at the now still body of the dreg. The foul, torn skin around its face juxtaposed with the pastel pink of the bedframe strut that he had used to suffocate it. In the dim auburn of the lamplight, the monster seemed to be peaceful lying there. Genon wondered if it had ever even known peace in its entire violent life before this moment. Perhaps the only place to find peace was in death. Maybe the Eden in his book only existed there, beyond the turmoil of this chaotic and painful existence. He thought of giving up. It would almost be a relief, like falling asleep. What is it all for? He thought, as a small tear somehow welled from his dry, dust-covered eyes and cut its way down the chalk-like surface of his cheek. Why? He whispered. Exhausted, he rolled his head over to look in the other direction. There was a small picture frame hanging unevenly on the concrete wall. Lethargically, he rose to his feet and shuffled over to the small frame, plucking it from the wall. For a moment he examined it curiously. He wiped the thick dust from the glass. It was words. They were stitched into fabric, as if sewn with a needle and thread. It said, "Hope is faith in a dream coming true. From hope will come strength to see you through. If you have hope, then you need only your dreams to have purpose in all you do." Genon pondered the tattered verse as he stood there in the dim, dusty bunker. After a moment he wiped the tear from his face, straightened himself up and headed toward the hatch door. The all-encompassing, unempathetic white of day pierced the darkness of the room as he lifted the hatch door open again. His eyes blinded for a moment as the light bounced off his face. He stood up and patted himself down, releasing a sizable cloud of dust that was promptly taken away by the wind. He scanned the horizon of the wastes, not really knowing what to look for by now. He could see in the far distance some kind of structure with dark smoke or ash coming from the top. Maybe a factory camp, he thought. It was no place that one would go willingly, but it was really the only landmark of any kind that he could see. And it might just be the only place left where people might still be alive. At that point, any hope, no matter how tenuous, was enough. Genon thought about the stitched words in that child's room. He imagined the mother carefully sewing every segment of that passage, word by word. He tucked his old book into the pocket of his tattered coat and started off in the direction of the smoke. He looked behind him at the wastes. The ground was warping the air above it with reflected heat from the sun. The vast nothingness was like an entity in itself, an entity that seemed to hate him, just for being there. Eden's little face was illuminated with all the colours of reflected light from the beautiful necklace she had created. A smile snuck its way onto her face as she began to twirl and twirl around on the spot like the last little ballerina. The unrelenting crowd bustled by her on all sides like a river. All the tiny pirouettes of her imaginary repertoire, some of them even verging on simulacra. She of course had no idea what ballet was. Perhaps it was an innate human inclination that had evolved itself into the long-forgotten art form. Or perhaps genetic memory? Her little muscles moving by the instruction of tiny strands and particles that were coded by thousands of years of human arts and culture. In any case, there she twirled, like an old music box, forgotten and discarded, but twirling nonetheless. The hunger came groaning and grumbling back onto the mantle of her focus, eventually bringing her back to reality. She also realised that the air was beginning to seem dirtier. She knew that she would need to get to work and make her markers so that she could refill her mask and feed herself. She hung the large, beautiful necklace around her neck and gathered up the other smaller wristbands and bracelets from the small piece of cloth. She stacked them all on her tiny wrists and set off through the busy street. "Trinkets for your loved ones back home," she hollered with a renewed sense of enthusiasm. "Souvenirs from her museum." As she turned to broadcast her wares in the adjacent direction, her path was suddenly blocked by an extremely tall, slender woman in a very pretty shiny coat. Her skin was like some kind of shimmering film, covered in small scales. It had translucent swirls of almost rainbow-like patterns. It reminded Eden of the oil streaks on the wet road that she had often seen while walking the streets. "Gifts for you or your family, miss?" Eden proposed to the slender woman. She held up her small wrist, adorned with her bracelets of wire and glass.
"Oh, how quaint,"
the tall woman hissed, in an almost forced-sounding whispery tone.
"Pretty, in a crass, vulgar sort of way, isn't it? Like a museum itself, really. In fact, it's quite provincial. Hoo, hoo, hoo."
Eden wasn't quite sure what the lady meant by those words, but she wasn't going to waste this chance to make a sale. She lowered her arm and clutched at the wonderful necklace that she had around her neck. She held it up proudly, as high as she could, so that the very tall lady could see it.
"Hoo, hoo, what's this? Now this is really something, isn't it?"
Eden's face lit up with pride as the woman examined her work.
"Truly a masterpiece of subversive reflection. Hoo, hoo, hoo. A parody in form. A product of its environment indeed. Hoo, hoo, hoo."
Eden again wasn't sure what the lady meant by those fancy words. But as best as she could understand, the woman seemed impressed.
"I should have it to show my friends. I'm sure they will find it quite sad. Hoo, hoo, hoo. How much are you asking for it?"
Eden could hardly believe her ears. It seemed like this very elegant, slender woman really liked her necklace, even to the point of saying that it would make her friends jealous.
"How much?"
the tall woman hissed, her joviality beginning to give way to impatience. Eden paused and realised she didn't know what to ask for it. She hadn't even thought of a price at all. She didn't know what to say, not wanting to offend the nice lady, but at the same time knowing that she would need 100 markers to breathe, another 100 to eat, and then 1,000 for the ship ride to the Green Planet. She froze for a moment.
"Oh, I see then. You are thinking now that you could sell it for more. How very Hermesian of you indeed, much like your trinkets."
Eden stared back at her blankly.
"Okay, then I guess it's when in Hermesium, do as the Hermesians do. After all, I won't be back here any time soon. 500 markers,"
the slender woman announced, looking Eden in the eye as she bent down to meet her face to face. Eden's eyes grew large. She had never gotten that much for anything she had made before. She was truly speechless at this offer. The tall lady frowned. Her expression seemed to grow cold.
"How dare you? Okay, then fine. 600, but that's for everything you have, and that is my final offer. Take it or leave it. I am beginning to lose interest."
Eden's heart began to beat fast. She snapped herself out of her contemplation and nodded profusely as she began to retrieve all of the bracelets from her arms. She presented them along with the necklace to the tall lady. The woman snatched them from her little hands and stuffed them into her bag, then stared back at her for a moment, as if pondering something.
"Hoo, hoo, hoo,"
she rasped as she produced 6 pink notes and threw them coldly at Eden's feet. The slender lady stared curiously at her for a second before turning and slinking away, back into the anonymity of the crowd. The notes landed softly on the ground in front of Eden. She stared at them, almost with disbelief, then quickly scooped them all up and clutched them tightly. She couldn't believe it. As she stuffed the notes into her pocket, she thought that maybe for the first time, in as long as she could remember, she would be able to go to sleep with a full belly tonight. She rushed through the bustling crowd, almost breaking into a skip as she made her way to the place where the vending machines were. As she arrived there, she paused a moment, looking at all the small coloured packages of different shapes and sizes that sat beyond the glass front of the vending machines. She had never bothered to look so closely at all of them before, as she could really only ever afford the cheapest one at the bottom. Costing 100 markers, it was a small white wrapper containing a sort of brown paste that had a salty kind of flavour. But now she could afford anything from the bottom row right up to the middle 2 rows. Her little face was struck dumb with a kind of option paralysis. The thought of being able to afford almost any of these items of food was so exciting. Her mind raced, imagining new flavours and textures of which she had never before sampled. She couldn't read the writing on the coloured packages to know what they were exactly, but she knew that they had to be delicious, as some of them cost 500 markers and more. She thought about buying the most expensive one that she could afford and tasting the luxurious flavours that were, until now, beyond her grasp. Then she thought of buying 4 or 5 of the cheapest ones and feasting on a larger meal than she had ever had before. For the first time, she would know what it felt like to be full. As her little mind pondered all of these options and her eyes peered through the glass of the vending machine, a loud voice came ringing through her mask from the inside, just like that large man's voice at the tour ship. It was coming from the translator device. The voice was loud and insistent. Eden looked for the person speaking to her, but she couldn't see anyone aside from the indifferent crowd of passers-by. She peered behind the vending machine to see a holo panel. It was an image of a very wealthy and opulent-looking lady speaking the words that Eden could hear. Behind the holo panel, the storefront was a fashion and clothing stall. It was an advertisement. She soon realised that the voice from the holo panel was now talking to her in Earthspeak.
Hermesium Festival, only 1 day left until the market's greatest celebration. Ring in the new year and new fortunes in the finest fashion.
Eden looked back at the vending machine, her little brow furrowed in contemplation, when an idea dawned on her. If she saved as many of these markers as she could, and if she could make more at the festival by selling trinkets, then she might be able to afford the tour to the Green Planet. Now she was even more excited than she was about the prospect of having a full belly. She raised her hand to the glass and pressed on the picture of the small white package containing the salty brown paste, then pulled out one of the pink 100 marker notes that she had in her pocket and slid it into the machine. It responded with a thud. As the small morsel plopped onto the tray near her feet, she reached down and picked it up as she turned to make her way to the atmosphere kiosk. The light of the Hermesium sky, that was barely visible through the smoke and fog of the market, was beginning to give way to the artificial light of the advertising holo panels and streetlights. Eden slid another pink 100 marker note from her pocket into the atmosphere kiosk. She retrieved her mask from the port and fitted it back to her face before succumbing to a hearty yawn. The thoughts and possibilities of her new plan whizzed around her mind as she strolled through the market, her small hands clutching at the parcel of brown paste that she was eating as she walked. The smell of the refuse block began to become noticeable.
Perfect,
she whispered to herself as she broke into a quicker pace. The discarded mounds of the scrapyard would offer a great place to think and even spend the night. After all, she was growing sleepy by now. The smell of the refuse block grew stronger as Eden approached. The odour was unpleasant, but it was worth it for what the refuse block offered. She had finished her small meal now and proceeded to open the white wrapper flat, allowing her to lick every last smudge of the brown salty paste that she could. Climbing to the top of the first great mound of junk, she found a small nook with a sheet of old tin over the top and curled up underneath it. Her tired eyes grew heavy as her little mind raced with thoughts of the pretty necklace she had made and the green forest world that now seemed tangibly within her grasp. Among the distant humming of the market and the smell of the scrapyard, she drifted off to sleep. Her dreams sometimes seemed more like memories that she tried her hardest to forget. Images of the hot, greasy landing-strut compartment on the cargo ship. The ship Mother had told her to hide on. In her dreams she would hear the ear-splitting screams of the engines as they forced the ship to leave atmosphere. She would feel the red-hot steel of the landing strut as the fire from outside burned upon re-entry. The dreams were so vivid that she could even taste the choking fumes of the engine bay that made her sick for hours and hours. Scared, confused, and utterly alone in the claustrophobic darkness of the engine bay, in a ship thrown like a stone into the infinite blackness of space. She never thought of these memories during the daytime, when she could focus on other things, but in her dreams she had no choice, no control.
Festival tonight! Last day to adorn yourself in the finest and let it all hang out for the Hermesium New Year.
Eden's little eyelids snapped open as the shrill voice of the announcer rang inside her mask. She sat up straight in excitement and propped up the old sheet of tin that had covered the nook where she slept. Peering out to see the sky, her eyes squinted in the sun that shone through the smoke and fog of the Hermesium sky.
It's already light,
she shouted in surprise. There was no time to lose now. The festival was tonight, and she had work to do if she was going to make her markers and get to the green planet. She threw back the old piece of fabric and sprang to her feet, surveying the vast discarded landscape of the refuse block. She yawned and stretched as her eyes adjusted to the light of day, sighting an old green bucket not far from where she was standing. She went over and picked it up.
Perfect,
she thought. She smiled as she walked on. Today felt different. The world seemed a little less cruel. It was like the city was on her side. The anticipation of the market-goers for the festival coincided with her anticipation of escaping to the green paradise, and in her little mind, it all felt connected. For the first time in her life, the world seemed to be cheering her on. She started to run toward the edge of the garbage mound that she had spent the night on. As she approached the precipice of that enormous mound of unwanted rubble, she could see starkly in the light of day the true endlessness of the refuse block.
It's not block-shaped at all,
she thought to herself. In fact, it seemed to go on forever, as if the whole planet was just covered in massive piles of discarded trash. A determined little grin stretched its way across her face as she thought of all the untold shiny pretty things that she might find to make her trinkets out of for the festival tonight. She took a few steps back and bolstered herself with a kind of naive stoicism before taking a running leap off of the edge of the trash heap. Her little legs braced and skidded as she slid and ran down the huge embankment toward the basin of the scrap that awaited her at the foot of the mound. Her little feet careful to avoid the sharp and pointy-looking things on the way. All the twinkling, shining bits of tin and plastic, paper and wire, string, glass, cloth and rubber, and even some things she had never seen before. So many pretty pieces of once loved or once useful things. Eden picked them out of the garbage like a little magpie and tossed them into her green bucket as she went on wandering about the refuse block, and in an hour or two she had almost filled the bucket completely. She decided that she would ascend the scrap mound once again to the little nook where she had spent the night. There she would have the old metal sheet for shade as she worked on her next glinting masterpiece. It was warm in the light as she climbed the hill. She soon found that it was much harder going up the mound than it was to run down it, as she had done so eagerly. Nearing the summit again, she found that she did not recognize the landscape right away. Looking around the hilltop for anything familiar, she realised that she must have strayed along the foot of the mound, looking for shiny things, and had probably wandered to the opposite side before climbing back up. While marching purposefully to the opposite side of the mound, where her small nook was, she happened to spot something in the scrap, about 3 or 4 metres away. She wondered what it could be. As she strolled closer to get a better view, she all of a sudden froze with shock. The strange thing that she could see in amongst the garbage was an eye, and it was looking right at her, not blinking at all. Just staring. The brownish light of the Hemesian sun struggling through the smog and smoke of the atmosphere was bathing little Eden as she stood there, clutching her green bucket of shiny things. She was frozen in place for fear of the eye staring back at her from the pile of scrap that sat a few metres away. After a few moments, her curiosity began to surpass her trepidation, and she slowly, cautiously began to edge closer to the unblinking eye. As she drew closer to it, she saw that it was not responding to her movements, not following her hand as she waved them to provoke a reaction. She then determined that this eye was not real at all and boldly strolled over to it. She began pulling away the tin and old containers that had obscured it so mysteriously. Soon the eyebrow was visible, and then the whole face. It was some kind of hard metal sign. She pulled at it with all the might her little arms could muster, and it gave way suddenly. She fell onto her back, the large sign flopping on top of her with a wallop. The sign was metal but quite thin and not very heavy. As Eden lifted it off of herself, she noticed that it was very old and a little rusty on the edges. She propped it up against some old boxes to see it in the light. And as she stood back, she saw her. The most beautiful woman Eden had ever seen before. Her eyes were of crystal blue and her hair was smooth like running water. She had the most beautiful dress of shiny golden thread and jewels on her long, delicate fingers. Eden's little eyes widened with awe as she beheld the old advertising sign. She was used to seeing lots of advertising panels all over her museum, but never one like this. This woman was like Mother. Like her. This woman was human. Eden stared at the old sign. There must have been a time and a place where humans like her and Mother were free and happy and clean like the beautiful lady in the picture. Her imagination continued to extrapolate as she studied the curves and lines of the beautiful gold-threaded dress the lady was wearing. She looked down at herself, pulling at the little tattered cloth dress that she had on, holding it out to see it in the sunlight. Maybe if I had a beautiful gold-threaded dress like the lady in the picture, I could sell more trinkets at the festival. Her thoughts soon blossomed into an idea. She gasped in excitement as she remembered the pile of gold and green coloured ribbon wire she had passed earlier. She had gone past it before, as it was too big for her bucket. But maybe it was just the perfect thing for a special dress. Eden hurried back to where she had seen the ribbon wire, locating it with ease. She clutched one end of the huge tangled mess. How will I carry this back? She thought. She pondered this problem briefly before holding the end of the ribbon to her little waist and twirling it round and around on the spot as fast as she could. The ribbon wire was wrapping around her little body as she looped and wound it up with her spinning motion. After a few moments of this, she had what she thought would be enough of the shimmering golden cable to fashion her special dress. However, she was now quite dizzy and somewhat off balance. With the wire wrapped and bunched all around her, she tried to take a step forward and promptly toppled over like a wobbly spinning top. She stared at the sky as she lay on her back. The world was still spinning. She decided to take a moment there and wait for the dizziness to wear off. Later, back at her little nook at the top of the refuse mound under the shade of the old sheet of tin, Eden worked on her very special festival gown. She had the old sign propped up there in front of her so she could study the beautiful lady in the picture and try to emulate the wonderful golden dress that adorned her. On her way back, she had also found a very shiny slither of reflective metal that she could see herself in. She had this leaned up next to the picture of the lady so that she could better see how her dress would fit. She was determined to make this special, her little fingers weaving and bending the golden ribbon cable into various patterns and knots. As the day went on, she had formed the ribbon wire into a large enough sheet that she could now wrap it around herself and make the shape of the dress. She pulled the rather heavy golden sheet up and around her waist and then hoisted it up under her arms. She looked to the polished metal to see her reflection, and as she did, her little eyes widened. The discarded ribbon wire was now a wonderful golden dress, and the oil that was smeared on the polished metal gave a kind of blurry dream-like effect on her reflection, making the sparkles of gold in the sunshine stretch out into long lines of reflected light. This gown was good enough to rival any of the outfits of the Hermesium festival goers, she thought to herself as she smiled with pride. As Eden worked on her masterpiece, fastening the ribbon wire together with copper strands she had found and making 2 little straps on either side to hold it up, she started to find it harder and harder to see. The gold ribbon cable wasn't shining as much as it had before. "It's getting darker," she thought. "No, it's getting dark." She realised that being so focused on making the golden dress, she had forgotten all about making any trinkets to sell. She was so frustrated with herself, she picked up the green bucket and hurled it off the top of the garbage mound. It clunked to the bottom a second or 2 later. She could hardly see it now, it was getting so dark. She couldn't believe she had let herself become so distracted. She thought about the tour ship and going to the green planet. She thought of Mother and Father and the festival. Her tired little eyes began to well with tears, when all of a sudden, like a slap to the face, there came a massive bang, like an explosion from off in the distance toward the market. Her attention snapped to the direction of the noise, her senses sharpened and alert. The sound was a firework of some kind, and the huge sound of it, although in the distance, bellowed and reverberated through the city walls and out into the refuse block, splitting the twilight like artificial thunder. "The Hermesium Annual Festival of Trade and Commerce has now officially begun," a booming voice shouted from her mask. She heard the sound of a huge crowd cheering off in the direction of the market centre. Very loud, awful-sounding music began thumping and echoing from that epicentre as well. Eden knew that even without trinkets to sell, she would have to get there to the market centre as quickly as she could if she had any chance of making some markers. She grabbed the gown that she had created and squeezed herself into it as fast as she could. She scavenged a few things from the ground that she might be able to use and stuffed them into her cloth pouch as she began to run hastily down the mound in the direction of the market. As she descended the refuse mound and approached the level ground on the way back to the street, she pulled her cloth pouch open. She knew she would need something to sell, but there wasn't enough time. She would have to try and weave some small bracelets while she walked. She hurried along, walking fast and weaving her little trinkets. Occasionally glancing up to see where she was going, when abruptly her foot hit something hard, tripping her over. She hit the ground with a thud, dropping her bracelets and shiny things all over the dirt. "This silly thing, why had it just been left here in the street?" she thought. It was going to cost her even more time. It was a fairly large cardboard box, just sitting there as if it had fallen off the back of a cargo vessel or something. She got to her feet and kicked it away as hard as she could, and as it rolled forward, it split open, releasing a clutter of small blue and purple-coloured objects. Eden's flustered expression gave way to curiosity as she bent down to inspect these small tubes. Each one of the bluish-purple cylinders had its own wrapper covering it. They all looked new, as if this box was going to a stall in the market, but had somehow made its way here instead. She picked one of them up and examined it. There was some strange writing on the packet. As she went to open the plastic wrapper, a voice coming from her mask abruptly began to explain.
Hermesium Holopops, a favourite disposable party toy for children and adults alike. Simply push the button and right in front of your eyes you will see images from your own mind, projected in holo format for 10 seconds. It could be your deepest desires or your worst fears. What fun! Remember to dispose of expired holopops responsibly.
The voice was gone with a click, and Eden was left staring at the holopop in her hand, her eyes wide with excitement. What an amazing thing to just be a party toy, she thought. She opened the wrapper, held the small cylinder up in front of her and pushed the button. As soon as she did this, a flash erupted from the toy and a sheet of fantastic coloured light unfurled right before her eyes. It was like a wall of water rippling and moving. Then she began to see images through the water. It was the beautiful lady from the old advertising sign in her dress of golden thread. But she was alive, laughing and smiling in the light. Eden's little face lit up. She was transfixed by the lifelike images. But the image of the lady quickly dissolved away, and it all turned darker. Smoke began swirling around like a storm. Images began to form and come through the smoke. It was Mother, staring blankly in the dark, with tear marks cutting the film of dust that covered her face. She was strewn across the razor wire, alone on the outskirts of the factory camp. Eden screamed out desperately, "Mother!" There was no response to her cries as the image of Mother faded into the smoke. Then, just like that, the hologram disappeared, and a small click came from the holopop as it expired. The images from the holopop were make-believe, but the shock and pain that she felt from what she saw felt very real. Her little heart was beating almost through her chest. She tried to catch her breath while she inspected the expired holopop in her hand. "And now you just throw it away?" She had never seen something so impressive in her life. And yet to the people here, it was nothing but a cheap party toy for the festival. She looked over at the little bracelets she was weaving that had fallen on the ground near her. How ridiculous they looked, now that she could see the kinds of wonders that these people were used to. Counting all the packets from the box she had found, her total inventory was now 9 holopops, minus the one she had used up. "This will surely get me enough markers for the trip to the Green Planet," she thought, as she placed them carefully into her small cloth pouch. She hoisted the pouch over her shoulder and made her way to the market centre, now with a renewed hope. Before. After they took Genon's body away, Mother was coldly shoved back into her tent and kicked to the ground by the unfeeling boot of one of the heftier supervisors. She couldn't hold her tears back, although she tried everything she had inside not to show her sorrow to them. They murdered him. Genon was gone. The small slither of light in the darkness of her existence was so heartlessly snuffed out right in front of her. The dreams that they had were gone now, so what did it matter to live? Nothing mattered now. She glared at the supervisor with utter hatred. The pure, righteous hatred that is known only by the hopeless and downtrodden. She screamed, a shrill and cutting gravel of rage as she lunged forward, grabbing the throat of the large humanoid. The response was swift and brutal as the supervisor struck her with the back of its hand and restrained her by the shoulders. She felt powerless, but that feeling did nothing to quell her rage. She struggled to loosen its grip on her. Then, seizing her only opportunity, she clenched its arm in her teeth and bit down on it with all the strength she had. And to her surprise, it bled. Foul, thick blood, pearled with some kind of mucus, but definitely red. The metallic taste of it invaded her mouth as she gritted her teeth further. The supervisor threw her back to the other side of the tent floor with a noticeable groan of frustration. Mother hit the ground hard, her head smacking against the ground. She turned back to the supervisor, dazed and disoriented. Her head ached as she struggled to focus. Another supervisor appeared standing at the tent opening. The two stared at her for a moment, and then the one she had bitten produced a weapon from its holster and aimed it down at her.
"Abort, employee."
She had rarely ever heard one speak. Its voice was low, unnaturally low, not human-sounding at all. Mother knew this was the end for her. She closed her eyes and waited for them to take the last thing she had left.
"Wait,"
the monotone voice of the second supervisor interjected. Mother opened her eyes to see it kneeling down close to her, studying her almost. It pulled out a small device that had some kind of beam coming from it. The supervisor ran the beam across her body. Mother was startled by this, but she was not about to let them see. She would rather die than give them the satisfaction. The light was a blue colour, but as the supervisor ran it across her body and it reached her abdomen, it began to flash a pinkish red hue and it chirped a series of strange tones. Her heart was beating hard now as the tension and confusion of the situation became hard to ignore. The supervisors made a loud roaring sound like anger, and the wounded one once again pulled its weapon up to meet Mother's gaze.
"Wait,"
the second one interrupted again. It pulled the weapon downward, away from Mother, and kneeled down in front of her again, reaching out and putting its hand on her stomach.
2 for 1.
It moaned in its horrible, malevolent drone.
2 for 1.
Both supervisors stood up and left the tent in silence. Mother let out a sigh as she dropped her show of strength. Her head was aching, and the room seemed to spin. She looked down at her stomach and held her arms around it. Could it really be that she was with child? She felt fear again, fear mixed with joy. Her tears fell onto the rags she had to cover herself. Now it was clear that she had no choice but to go on. She had to get her child out of this place, even if it killed her. She gazed out of the small hole in the back of her tent. In the distance, the cargo ships were noisily docking and loading. 2 for 1, she thought. Eden hurried along the roads and alleyways of her museum, making her way closer to the centre of the festival. She could hear all the voices and music, so many different sounds all running together and louder than she had ever heard it here before. It was the sound of a celebration. As she began to come closer to the main centre of the market, the crowd seemed to become thicker. People of all shapes and sizes laughing and cheering and drinking funny-coloured drinks. Some of them were chasing each other with a kind of dust on their hands, trying to smear it onto each other like some sort of game. The dust was brightly coloured in pink and violet. It looked like such fun. Approaching the last turn onto the market centre, Eden stopped to look at her reflection in the glass of a stall front. She checked her little golden ribbon wire dress and made sure her face was clean enough, wiping away any smudge marks she could see. Just as she was about to turn onto the festival centre, she felt a hard nudge as one of the people running by bumped right into her, knocking her against the wall somewhat. As she regained her balance, she realised that the coloured dust was all over the place. It was violet and twinkling, like a kind of smoke, that was falling down all around her. She was beguiled by it as it fell, and settled on her hair and shoulders. Dusting herself off, she had one last look at her reflection. And as she looked, her eyes began to widen. The violet shimmering colour in her hair, twinkling with star-like specks of glitter, and her wonderful golden dress shining and reflecting the lights from the festival. She almost couldn't recognise the image in front of her. For the first time in her little life, she felt like the lady on that old sign. Even with the atmosphere mitigator on her face, she felt different. She felt beautiful. Confident and excited about her plan to reach the green planet, Eden turned the corner to the market centre and found herself awestruck by what she saw. The massive pillars of light and holograms in the middle of the market, the spotlights and flashing coloured signs, the loud music, and thousands of people drinking and dancing. The mood was infectious. She had never seen anything like it in all her life. It was a spectacle to be seen. People were behaving quite differently than she had noticed before. They were more uninhibited, more reckless or relaxed. She saw that a lot of them had holopops already and were laughing at each other as they set them off, throwing the used cartridges on the ground with all the other mess. The images that came from their holopops seemed to be mostly of funny or rude things that they would all laugh at and tease each other like a party trick. Eden wondered why her images were so different. Was there something wrong with the holopops she had found? She looked out at the people all covered in their finery, laughing obnoxiously as they spilled their drinks all over one another. She realised that maybe it was because these people only had these kinds of silly thoughts in their head at this time. So that's what they were seeing. Eden gathered up her focus and readied herself to sell as many of these holopops as she could. One way or another, she was going to get on that ship tonight. She began to work her way into the boisterous crowd of the festival. As she made her ingress, she shouted up at the potential customers. "Holopops for the festival?" She was yelling as loud as she could, but the music and the cheering of the people were so loud that she couldn't even hear her own voice through it all. She looked up at a group of 3 men that seemed to know each other. They were singing and shouting arm in arm, sloshing their drinks all over each other. Eden tried again to shout as loud as possible. "Holopops!" But again she couldn't even hear herself. She decided to just reach out to one of them and tug on his clothes to gain his attention. She clutched the robe of the man closest to her. He was a very tall grey man, with thin vertical slits covering his eyes. She pulled at the robe insistently, and the man quickly peered downward in her direction. She produced one of the holopops from her little cloth bag and held it up for the man to see. He responded with a huge cry of laughter, or at least it seemed that he did, as he threw his head back and bounced up and down. He tapped his friends on the shoulders, and they all looked down at Eden. "Now I have their attention," she thought, as she scrambled to grab some more holopops from her bag. Holding 3 up in her hand, she then held up 2 fingers to hopefully indicate 200 markers. The men swayed and laughed boisterously. The tall one reached down, snatching the holopops from Eden's little hand, and passed one to each of his friends. She frantically waved her hands in front of the group with her 2 fingers up, hoping for payment. The man, laughing and swaying, carelessly bumped into her, knocking her to the ground. But she quickly regained herself and rose to her feet. The other men were using the holopops already. She could see the holograms. Images of one man being chased by some king or huge animal, and they were laughing hysterically at this. Then the hologram finished. As the man tossed the used cartridge onto the street, Eden again shook her hand at the men, holding up 2 fingers. They looked down again to see her. It was almost as if they had forgotten that she was there already. They turned with their backs to her and tossed a bunch of pink notes behind them. Her eyes lit up as the pink notes fell around her like confetti. She quickly gathered them all up and counted them. There were 3 notes. That's 300 markers, she thought, as her little heart almost skipped a beat with excitement. With the markers she had from yesterday, she was just over halfway there already. Eden moved through the undulating crowd of the festival. The people were getting more and more loud and clumsy with every passing minute. After about an hour and a few more of her mimed sales pitches, she had only 3 holopops left in her bag. She gathered up the pink notes she had earned and began to count them, unable to hide the joy from her face as she realised that she had done it. She now held 1,000 real markers in her little hands. She couldn't remember ever being so excited and quickly began to work her way towards the tour ship with the 10 pink notes clutched tightly. As she slowly weaved closer to the tour kiosk, she caught sight of that very large man with the flat teeth again. He wore the same clothes as before, but he had some coloured beads around his huge neck this time. He stood there by the entry to the ship with a stack of markers in his hand, bobbing rhythmically to the thudding of the loud music. She hurried over towards him. He looked over to see her coming and began to laugh as she stopped in front of him.
Not you again, human! You have 1,000 markers, then?
If it weren't for her mask, she wouldn't have heard the man at all over the noise of the festival. She held out her hand, still clutching the pink notes as tight as she could.
Oh, well, the thing is enterprising, then. That's the spirit.
Eden pointed to the panel that had the picture of the green planet. The man nodded and held out his very thick hand. She finally relinquished her tight grip on the 10 crumpled pink notes. She felt the blood rush back into her little fingers as the markers unfurled on the man's large grey palm. While he stood counting the notes in front of her, Eden's mask began to flash red. This meant that she only had less than an hour of atmosphere mitigation left. She was so carried away with selling holopops that she had forgotten to fill it, and now she had no more markers. Her moment of panic was interrupted by the large man taking her by the arm and motioning her up the ramp to board the ship. Her worries were soon put to rest as she saw a sign above the entrance. Please remove any masks for the duration of the tour. Gases provided inside. The words were in Earthspeak. As she read the sign, she had the realization that she was leaving Hermesium forever, and she wouldn't need this silly mask ever again. A feeling of pure joy enveloped her as she turned and pulled the atmosphere mitigator from her face. She looked at it for a moment and smiled before throwing it out onto the street as hard as she could. The small device that had kept her breathing through all those hard times on Hermesium now trampled under the clumsy feet of the rambunctious festival crowd. The large man looked over at the discarded mitigator and then turned back to face Eden. His immense brow was furrowed in bemusement as he stared at her for a moment, apparently confused by her actions. She didn't care. She was going to be free now, free from Hermesium forever. The ship was dirty and metallic. On the inside there were many pieces of trash and soggy paper on the floor. Eden assumed this had made its way in during the festival. She walked through the opening as the ramp closed behind her. Am I the only one taking this tour? She thought to herself, as she noticed that there were no other passengers. There was a large seat that had some screens in front of it. She sat down in the chair and waited for a moment. Her face itched from where her mask had come off. The skin was rough and a little sore. It had been on her face for such a long time, but it didn't matter to Eden now. She had never been happier. She might be on her way to the paradise from Mother's book. Mother might even be there. Maybe even Father. In any case, she was finally going to be free. She was finally leaving. The seat was far too big for little Eden. Her legs were fully stretched out on the bottom of it as she sat waiting in anticipation of her escape. Suddenly, all 3 of the huge screens blinked into operation at once, and a set of headphones popped up from the armrest of the seat. A picture appeared on the screen in front of her with an animation of a person putting the headphones on their head. She promptly picked them up and placed them in position as the image instructed. The screens began to show a list of strange writing. As it scrolled down to the bottom, she recognised the word Earthspeak. She touched it, and just as she did, the screens came alive with pictures of all kinds of different planets and stars. So you have decided to take the trip of a lifetime with Hermesium V Tours? Good for you! Please select the exotic world of your choice from our menu while our V-pilots prepare for launch. Butterflies swooned in Eden's stomach as she flicked through all the different worlds on offer. So many worlds! Can this little ship really reach all of them? She thought. She had never felt this kind of excitement before. The anticipation of escaping Hermesium, the thought of seeing the green paradise and finally being free. She missed Mother so much, and she couldn't ignore the thought of seeing her again. She could hardly wait to jump into her arms and tell her all about what she had been through, and all that she had done to make it back to her. She hoped so strongly to see Mother again, to feel safe again. Her heart beat faster than ever as she came to the green planet on the screen. Forest World Alpha, it said. An almost impressible smile rose up on her face as she pushed the selection without hesitation. The ship began to shake and rumble as the call came over the speaker to fasten all seatbelts. Eden clutched at the armrests with her little hands and closed her eyes as the ship seemed to vibrate, almost like it was going to throw her right out of the seat. She struggled with the small belt, eventually succeeding in clicking the two metal clips together.
3, 2, 1, take off!
The sound of what must have been the pilot's voice now coming over the intercom. The shaking of the ship continued and seemed to get more and more violent. She started to feel slightly worried. Her eyes were tightly pursed shut, and she just held on tight to the seat as the rumbling and shaking eventually began to subside. The sounds of the takeoff soon gave way to a much quieter background hum of the engines whirring. She slowly relaxed her eyelids and peeked around the ship. It was very dark now. She felt cautiously at ease. The steady sound of the engines had a sort of comforting quality. She looked up at the screen in front of her. A large red arrow was pointing to the right, and there were words below it. Open your window. There was a small handle to the window cover. With no hesitation at all, she flung open the window shade, and what she saw absolutely astonished her. The beauty of space, the vastness of it, in all its grandeur. Clouds of dust and ice particles streaked by the window. Shimmering, glittering crystals of mineral and frozen vapour seemed to twinkle and dance as the movement of the ship dispersed them and gave them motion. Much further away, the most amazing colours of distant stars, shining with orange and teal hues, their light glinting through the immense clouds of phosphorescent gas. There were distant galaxies with halo-like rings emanating from their edges. Other planets with swirling surfaces like living marbles. Her eyes began to well with tears. She had never seen such beauty before. It was almost as if it was all there just for her, like the universe was putting on a show. It made all her struggles on Hermesium seem worth it. She felt a sudden jolt in the ship as the wonders of space seemed to trail off into a white fog that soon covered the window completely. She heard the intercom click as the pilot's voice returned.
Please remain seated now as we enter the planet's atmosphere.
How can we be here already? She thought. This must be one of the fastest ships around.
The ship once again began to rumble and shake in the same way it had during takeoff. Eden held onto her seatbelt and stared through the window. The white fog seemed to whip by the ship intermittently, giving way to flashes of blue in the distance. These flashes came faster and faster, and then the white fog subsided, to reveal a crystal blue sky, vermilion and serene in its beauty. The sun and the light came flooding in through the window. Her face came alive with joy. She was really here. The rumbling of the turbulence once again subsided, and the gentle purring of the cruising engines returned as they guided the ship to make its descent. She peered attentively at the window. She began to see the canopy of a forest, green treetops and vast clearings of the deepest emerald. The sunlight was bouncing off the waves of huge lakes, with animals and birds surrounding them in droves. Her heart welled at the sight of those wonders as they scrolled so quickly past her view. She couldn't wait to land and step off this dirty metal ship, to run onto the soft grass and breathe the clean air. The air of paradise. The ship continued to descend closer to the ground. She could see the treetops getting extremely close now, but the ship was not slowing down. They must be looking for a good landing spot, Eden thought to herself. And then the pilot's voice came over the intercom once again, and the words hit her like a hammer to the heart. "We hope you have enjoyed our tour. Now hold on tight for our ascent back to Hermesium." Eden's wonder turned to sheer panic. She struggled with her seatbelt as she cried out to the closed door of what was apparently the pilot's section.
"Let me off, please! Land and let me off here!"
There was no answer at all from the pilots. She fumbled with the seatbelt and eventually unclipped herself and slid from the edge of the large seat, her feet hitting the cold metallic floor of the ship as she ran toward the pilot's door.
"Please, I need to get off!"
She cried as loud as she could, pounding on the door with her little hands. She continued to plead with the pilots, but the door stayed shut, and not one word was heard in response. She turned back to see the window and the scenery whizzing by. They were still very low to the ground and appeared to now be flying over a large lake of some kind.
"Say farewell to the exotic sights of the forest world now, as we begin our ascent."
The voice was shrill and crackling as it came through the speaker. There was no change in their tone of voice or mood at all, despite all of her pleading and begging as she banged on the door. Eden realised that they would not stop. Not for her, and probably not for anything. She looked over to her left at the hatch to the ship that she had entered through. There was a small red lever on the door. She lunged over toward it as the ship began to rumble and shake once again. Holding herself steady against the door, she looked at the red handle, and she knew that it must be some kind of emergency exit. Knowing that the pilots weren't going to stop, she could see that there was no time to waste. If she jumped from the door and hit the water at this height, there was a good chance that she would survive. She thought for a moment about Mother, about how brave she was the night they escaped from the factory camp. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Her knuckles were white as her hand clasped the red handle tightly. This was the only chance to escape. It was now or never. All or nothing. The ship rumbled and shook. The now loose seatbelt buckle clanged against the metallic floor of the ship, and the engines began to whir into a frenzied hiss that was so loud that she could hardly think straight. She clenched her eyes shut and prepared for the violent air to batter her as she pulled the red lever. The door opened. Her eyes were so tightly shut, but the air did not hit her. She panted, her heart racing with fear, but the air was thick and smelled of heavy grease and smoke. She heard noise, like music and voices, like a crowd. She opened her eyes to see a wet, crowded street. She turned back to the inside of the ship. The window was still illuminated, and the bright sunny light of the forest planet was still whizzing by. Her heart sunk into her belly. The noise. The choking air. It was the festival. It was her museum. She had never left. Eden fell to her knees, crestfallen. The tours were virtual. It all made sense to her now. That is how the ship got there so quickly. That was why the pilots had no reaction to her, and that is why the ship was so filthy. It was a ride. Her knees blared a little into the wet mud on the ground as the tears fell out of her eyes. The shock of reality had just destroyed her with a single blow. The large man with the square teeth leaned over and grabbed her by the arm. He shoved her away onto the cold, wet ground.
"Make way for the next customer, human."
As she hit the street, parts of her little golden dress broke off and fell into the silt on the slick road. And some of the brown water from the gutter had splashed onto her chalk-coloured hair. She lay there a moment, still in shock. Her eyes were open for so long that they began to sting. She had forgotten even to blink. The people rushed by as she lay on the roadside, their feet pounding and dancing all around her. She rolled onto her back to look up through the chaos and up to the sky. It was grey with smog and soot and peppered with flashes of light from fireworks and festival lights. She remembered what Mother used to say to her. Hope is faith, in a dream coming true. From hope will come strength to see you through. If you have hope, then you need only your dreams to have purpose in all you do. Eden stood herself up, brushed away the dust and mud from her legs, and straightened her little golden dress. Using a piece of plastic wrapper she retrieved from the street, she tied the broken shoulder strap of the gown back together. She felt her hair and the muddy, wet end of her fringe and tucked it behind her ear. She remembered that she still had 3 holopops she could sell. The air was so thick and filthy, it was becoming a struggle to breathe. She would need to sell a holopop to get the 100 markers and buy a new mask as quickly as possible. She strode out into the crowd, holding one of the holopops up in her hand.
"Holopops for the festival!"
she rasped as she tried to make her voice heard, the choking atmosphere dulling her every breath. The people of the festival seemed much more rowdy and clumsy now than they did earlier in the night. None of them seemed to notice her. They were loudly singing and cheering, stumbling arm in arm, holding each other up as they swayed back and forth, swilling their glasses of fluid. The coloured liquids were splashing on the ground as they wailed on and on, almost like children. Big, noisy children. As Eden continued through the crowd, she soon realised it was almost impossible to get anyone's attention now, as they were all so consumed with singing, drinking and dancing. She held up her holopop and shouted as loud as she could, but her little voice was lost in the thundering cacophony of the festival. And with her lungs full of the suffocating Hermesium air, she couldn't even hear herself, let alone be heard by anyone else. She wandered up to a group of people, swaying jovially with their glasses raised in the air. She tugged at the front of the man's robe to get his attention, pulling down on it hard. The man finally noticed and looked down at her with an annoyed expression. She desperately began to wave the holopop in front of the man's face. He appeared to laugh hard as he pushed her away in the opposite direction. Frustrated, she continued.
"Just have to sell 1 holopop and I'll be okay. Just 1,
she thought, while trying to steady herself on her feet. Stumbling on through the crowds, failing to get anyone's attention, she wished that she was tall like them, then they wouldn't ignore her. A trio of immaculately dressed women stood laughing and cheering near Eden, and seizing the chance, she lunged over at them. Her legs were now weakened by the lack of proper air, and she almost fell onto the first woman, clutching at the front of her fine dress. The tall woman looked down in umbrage. Eden was so exhausted she could hardly raise her arm to wave the holopop at the lady. But she somehow managed, The tall woman recoiled in disgust at the sight of this and promptly swatted her away, knocking her down onto the hard street, while her slender companions cackled in laughter. The 3 little holopops fell out of Eden's pouch and onto the street. Her little legs shook, and she realised quickly that she could no longer bring herself to stand up. She was too exhausted. Her eyes wanted so badly to shut, but she held them open with sheer will as she crawled along the ground to retrieve her holopops. She grabbed the first 2 from the mud and stuffed them back into her small cloth pouch. She scraped herself along the filthy street to the last precious holopop. She felt her vision getting fuzzy. It was getting harder to keep focus on it as she drew nearer. She reached out and picked it up, and as she held it, she squinted and strained her eyes to focus. She looked across at the mud and soot being trampled by the crowd of the festival. Amongst all the plastic cups and discarded trash that littered the ground, she could see thousands of small cylinders peppering the street between people's feet. Everywhere she looked, there they were, expired holopops all over the ground, like so much discarded disposable trash crumpled and trodden into the mud and silt of the street. She then realised that the people didn't care much about holopops. They were simply a festival novelty, a passing party trick for them to laugh at and throw away as if it were nothing. The fantasies they were projecting were mostly of themselves in vast seas of riches, or being ruler or tyrant over their friends, or some other vacuous vision. The object of their self-serving pursuits. So many near-identical visions of their dreams inspired by lives of privilege. The holographic extrapolations of lives that had never known sorrow or longing. It was no wonder the holopops were quite worthless to these people. Eden clutched the holopop and continued to pull herself along the street to the mouth of a thin alley, away from the people, coughing and struggling to breathe. She just wanted to get away from them, the loud, obnoxious crowd, the relentless thumping of their horrible music. She scraped and dragged herself on her stomach into the alleyway. There was a closed space at the end, like a tiny cul-de-sac. It had a small flickering streetlight there, at the end, that gave the little alley a warm yellow hue, although it was intermittent in its illumination. She approached the small of the alley, coughing and dragging her body along the ground, and she propped herself up, sitting against the hard, cold concrete of the alley wall. The festival roared on in the background as Eden tried, with all the might in her little body, to stay conscious. She could see the obnoxious crowd trampling, screaming and sloshing back and forth through the opening at the end of the alleyway. The vision of this began to warp and undulate as water welled in her little eyes. These tears needed no coercion. There was no straining to cry. There was no strength needed. There was no strength left. These tears simply fell from her eyes all by themselves, like rain on a dead-end road. She thought about the forest world and how beautiful it all was. All the vast tree-top canopies and lakes, all the wonderful animals and birds that she saw. All of it. Just a virtual image in a virtual joyride for spoilt children. She looked up at the small light flickering above her, the tiny filament struggling against the rain and the smog, fighting to stay lit, to stay alive. She felt her legs and arms turn heavy and numb, and her vision began to darken just a little. She looked down at her hand and the 3 holopops she had left. She forced her little arm to move and click the button on one of them. The alleyway lit up with magnificent light. The bright blue and purple colours spilled out of the small cylinder in Eden's hand. And as she squinted, she saw the most beautiful house in a lush green forest clearing, with birds flocking in the blue sky above. She saw a large, happy, four-legged animal with long golden fur running and playing with a ball in the yard, and hot-baked bread like Mother had told her about on a table on the porch. It was so real. She could smell the trees and the clean air. She could even smell the fresh bread. She heard a distant voice way off, calling to her from the house. It sounded so familiar. Then suddenly, with a sharp click, the darkness of the cold alleyway flooded back into Eden's focus as the holopop expired. She quickly reached for another. Her arms felt clumsy, and her numb fingers were barely able to hold it as she strained to depress the button. Again, the Hemesium night was parted in two by the crystalline hologram that unfurled before her. This time, there was a small room with no windows, like a bunker or basement. The warm yellow lamplight spilled onto a bedroom with a pretty pink quilt and pillows with stuffed toys on the floor. There was a woman in a dress with beautiful long red hair sitting at the foot of the bed. She was sewing something like a cross-stitch with words on it. She seemed so calm and serene. She was humming a tune to herself gently as she stitched. This scene felt oddly familiar to Eden, even though she had never seen any of it before. She could feel the warmth of the bed and the sweet smell of clean sheets. She felt a strange sense of safety and peace. There was a little girl in the bed sleeping, but she couldn't see her face. Then click. The holopop expired, and the warmth of the bed and the safety she felt was coldly taken away again. The image was gone. The noise of the festival was like a blur in Eden's ears now. All the sounds of the people and the thumping of the music, all seemed like it was becoming more and more distant. The foulness of the air, the cold, wet concrete of the alley, the flickering of the tiny bulb above, all echoing in her mind, like some kind of half-remembered dream. Her eyes were heavy, and her breath was shallow and faint. She couldn't feel her body anymore. All she could feel were the tears that ran down her face. She trembled as her little hands clutched the last holopop, and with the last ounce of strength in her, she barely managed to push the button. The green lush grass rushing past her eyes, rushing close and fast. She looked up. The house was there in the clearing. It was getting closer. She was flying towards it, weightless and swift, like a bird. The sunlight was brighter and more golden than she had ever seen in her life. She could smell the clean air and the trees. She was flying closer and closer. That voice came sweeping in from the distance once again. It was a woman's voice calling. She was so close now. It was getting clearer. Eden! Eden! The voice was calling her name. She was coming to the door of the house now, flying so fast. As she was about to hit the doorway, the whole world seemed to explode into bright light. The house dissolved into a million shards of brilliant colour as Eden burst through it. The trees bloomed into countless rays and crystalline flowers of the most amazing pinks and yellows. She could feel the warmth of the white sun dancing around her like a fire in the cold. The voice was nearer now. It was right there. As she turned forward again, her heart almost burst with sheer joy. Mother! It was really Mother. and by her side a strong, lean man with kind hazel eyes.
Could it be Father too?
Mother came closer. The warm light bathed her face as she smiled. She had never looked so beautiful.
Eden, my sweet little one, you have found me again, and we are home.
Eden could feel the safety and warmth of Mother's long arms as she held her tighter than anything. She couldn't wait to tell her all about what she had done and all the things she had seen. She closed her eyes and smiled, burying her head in Mother's hair. It was all going to be okay now. She was safe. She was home. The expired holopop fell to the ground and joined the rest of the discarded cylinders in the cold, wet mud of the Hemesium street. Above the alley, the tiny streetlight that had flickered and struggled for so long against the rain and smog finally succumbed to its fate and blinked its last pulse of light before the tattered filament went dark. Morning on Hemesium was usually a bustle with trade and tourism, all the market alive with noise and traffic. However, the morning after the festival was quite still and eerie. Today it was a kind of mock battlefield, covered in trash, with moaning, drunken partygoers staggering aimlessly around, soggy streamers and drink containers, chalk that had mixed with the rain, and mud covering everything. It took the markets of Hemesium a little longer to get underway on this day. As the clean-up crews began to sweep the streets and the worse for wear limped back to their hotels and ships, the large grey man with the square teeth was packing away his signs and locking up the tour ride. Counting his takings for the night, he strolled through the street on his way back to his apartment, his hands full of pink paper. The crews were hosing down the street as the man walked by counting his markers when he heard voices hollering from a small alleyway nearby. He looked over to investigate. There seemed to be some people gathered there. He stuffed the markers into his pocket and walked over to see what was going on. They were all crowded into the alleyway. There were workers and a few festival stragglers encircling something on the ground. The large grey man used his ample bulk to muscle his way to the front and see what all the fuss was about. As he reached the epicentre of the commotion, to his surprise, there on the wet, filthy ground lay the body of a small human girl-child. Her feet and legs were grazed and had bled into the mud and silt that was covering her skin. Her hair was matted with mud and chalk, and she was covered in a sheet made of old brown ribbon wire and rubbish. He noticed that she had no mask on. He could see her face quite clearly, and to his surprise she was smiling. She seemed peaceful, almost serene. "She has no mask," one of the workers mentioned. "She must have suffocated here, probably trying to sell these holopops." The man looked down at the little body, covered in scratches and filth. Even though he could see that she was obviously poor and destitute, he couldn't help but notice her peaceful expression. Ignoring the commotion, he studied it. He began to notice a nagging feeling that he couldn't justify. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling persisted. It was envy. He felt envy. The girl's little face was illuminated in a pristine peace. The worries and sorrows of this world could no longer touch her, wherever she was. This has been the audiobook recording of The Little Dream, written by Dana Wellman, 2020, narrated by Vicky Jo Eva.